What's up, everyone? It's Q from Retro Q Gaming, and I've been mulling over an idea for a new video now that I'm kind of dragging out to be a work in progress. So it's going to be a bit longer, but it's not going to be this video. But this one kind of segues into it, or segues out of it, whatever way you want to look at it. And without giving too much away on what the other video is going to be, and this one is more so, how do you decide what your favorite game or what your favorite game in a specific series is? Now, I know that's pretty vague and it could go any way, but the main reasons I want to look at it is for the simple reason is a lot of times what I've personally noticed is you don't consciously compare several games that you may enjoy in the same series and think, okay, this has this, this, and this, but it doesn't have that. And then that game has this, this, and this, but doesn't have that and that. So you don't consciously make lists or think about it. It just kind of, you don't really choose what your favorite game is or what your favorite game in a series is. It kind of chooses you, if that makes sense. I'm sure some of you can understand that. And I am going to use an example in this video now in a minute, and it's going to be it's not going to be my exact one. Well, it kind of will be, but it's more so going to look at the hows and whys of the whole thing. So the main reason I want to look at it is that let's take the Final Fantasy series. Okay, so Final Fantasy, obviously, it originated on the Famicom / the NES back in the day, and then it obviously progressed through the SNES and the PlayStation 2, etc., etc. But when you look at it, Final Fantasy is a very, very large and diverse series, and there's so many different games in the main series that all have fans of that particular game as either their favorite game ever or their favorite game in the Final Fantasy series. And there's tons of reasons for that, and most of them are pretty much legit, unless you feel that Final Fantasy VIII is your favorite game ever, in which case you're wrong. But yeah, you get the idea. The way I look at it is, okay, my personal favorite Final Fantasy game is a straight up 50-50 tie. Unfortunately, it's too close to be able to pick what I can actually pick as my favorite Final Fantasy game. It is a straight up 50-50 neck and neck tie between Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VI. Now, if you're American, that's going to be Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy III for you. But chances are, if you're watching this video, you know a bit more about retro games. Maybe not, but if you do, then you'll know the whole naming convention and all there. So once again, Final Fantasy IV and VI, if you're from outside of America, or if you're American, Final Fantasy 2 and 3. So the main reason I want to use this as an example is that here in Europe, Final Fantasy VII was the very first Final Fantasy game ever released. Now that's not including, say, Mystic Quest Legend on the Super Nintendo, which was originally renamed from Final Fantasy Mystic Quest in the US, but that's not including that. I'm talking main series Final Fantasy games. I mean, we had, what was it, the Final Fantasy Legend or Final Fantasy Adventure, whatever the Game Boy one was, but we're talking main series numbered Final Fantasy games. So Final Fantasy 1, 2, and that's proper 2, 3, proper 4, proper 5, proper 6, whatever, they were never released over here. The very first Final Fantasy game released in Europe was Final Fantasy VII. So obviously that was in the mid to late 90s on the PS1. So we had never played, and most of us didn't even realize, because at the time magazines weren't what they were and the internet wasn't what it was. So most of us, despite the game being called Final Fantasy VII, we all, there was the passing thoughts, like, oh, I wonder what happened to 1 through 6. And then, you'd forget about it and never think of it again. But essentially, we never knew that there was, a lot of us didn't know that there was Final Fantasies 1 through 6 on the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo. So we played this. We grew to love Final Fantasy VII for the absolutely, I can't even think of a word. I'm going to say, phenomenon that it actually is. And despite starting that and starting as a PS1 user, so your first entry into the Final Fantasy series as a PS1 game, it's easy to understand why many people consider Final Fantasy VII their favorite Final Fantasy game, if not their favorite game of all time. So that's completely understandable. And like I said, all those opinions are definitely valid unless, as I said earlier, you think the Final Fantasy VIII is your favorite one, in which case you're wrong. It's that simple. But anyway, so most people will usually say it's like, oh, well, it's the first game you played in the series. It's obviously gonna hold special meaning to you, and it'll always be your favorite and all stuff like that. I have a counterpoint to that. I have never said Final Fantasy VII is my favorite Final Fantasy game. If you were listening at the start of this video, I said 4 and 6, 50-50 tie. And the reason why I think this is a case study worth looking at or using as an example is that even though Final Fantasy VII was the first Final Fantasy game I ever played, it was the first Final Fantasy game just in 3 dimensions on a disc-based system with FMVs and all in it as well, and whatever extra benefits that the PS1 brought. When you look at that, I didn't play Final Fantasy 4 and 6 for about five more years or so. It wasn't until early 2002 where I first played Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VI. I believe I played Final Fantasy VI first. I'm pretty sure I did, actually. I'm pretty sure I played Final Fantasy VI first. And then later on, I got the collection with 4 and 5. And then the anthology with 1 and 2. But that's beside the point. So I'm pretty sure I played 6 first. And then I played 4 and 5. So, 4 is the obvious one in there. So even though I played Final Fantasy VII first, and obviously Final Fantasy VII has a place in my heart that can never, ever be lodged from there. It's such an influential and important game in every way. There's no denying that whatsoever, and nothing can ever shake that. But even having said all that, playing Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VI, be them technologically inferior to Final Fantasy VII, there's still something about it. Something about those two games. The story in Final Fantasy VII is obviously very good. I've no issues with that at all. But something about Final Fantasy IV with the whole Cecil and Kain thing, Final Fantasy VI with the whole Terra thing, I don't know, when you compare everything in those games, in 4, in 6, and we'll just use 7 as another kind of comparison, while I can't express in words properly or accurately or adequately, whatever way you want to look at it, of what Final Fantasy VII means to me. And many people, not just myself, but I'm talking about me here. So even though I can't properly portray what Final Fantasy VII means to me, I feel like I can still enjoy 4 or 6 a little bit better. Even though, like I said, they were technologically inferior and held back possibly in several ways by them being technologically inferior, being from the Super Nintendo versus the PS1, it's the quality of everything about them. Even though I didn't play them, like I said, till much later, till 4 or 5 years later, it's just something about those games. And I know I've said it a few times now, but even though they are inferior in some ways, technologically speaking, you look over and you can't even go with the Final Fantasy VII aspect of going, oh, nostalgia, the first one, 3D, this, that, and the other. I feel that doesn't even come into the equation because these games are rivaling, if not surpassing it. So I just think that's curious because it's very rare I sit down and think, I wonder why I like Final Fantasy IV more than 7. I wonder why I like Final Fantasy VI more than 7. I wonder, why I go neck and neck between 4 and 6. I never specifically think about it. It evokes that feeling and emotion in me that those are my favorite Final Fantasy games. I'm not consciously picking them. I sit down, I'll play 4, I'll sit down, I'll play 6, I'll sit down, I'll play 7. I'm like, 4 and 6 were a bit better, a bit more enjoyable. So I just think it's really strange that something can happen that way. And like I said, I'm using the Final Fantasy series and myself as the main example for this video. So I'm curious because there's so many other series that the exact same thing will happen. Legend of Zelda is obviously a big series. I'm not going to get into that one in this video. I'll give you a little hint though that does come into play in the other video I mentioned at the start. But you get the idea. So there's so many ones. I mean, Legend of Zelda is also a very big series with multiple main games and multiple people who have different varying reasons for what their favorite game is. Some people will say the original Legend of Zelda is the best one. Some people will say Link to the Past is best. Some people will say Ocarina of Time. Some people will say Majora's Mask. I've heard people say Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword. I'm sure there's going to be people saying Breath of the Wild next year if it ever comes out. So you get the idea, you get what I'm going for, and many people they have these perfectly valid reasons. Some of them will be edged in nostalgia, some of them won't be. Some of them will be speaking objectively, some of them will be speaking emotionally, and that's perfectly fine. I completely understand that. Absolutely understand that. So, I'm curious, what do you think are key factors of what you can, I won't say what you will choose to be your favorite game or your favorite game in a series. Do you feel that it's something you consciously do, or do you personally consciously do it? Do you say take in comparisons and think about it, or do you just go with, I feel like this was better, and then look back on it, I'm like, maybe it's because of this, this, and this is why I thought it was better. So, do you feel it first and then analyze it later, or do you sit down and go for like by like comparison and then that's how you decide? Or do you think the game picks you? It's completely there is no right or wrong answer here, but I want to know all that from everyone. You can use whatever game or whatever series you want. You don't have to stick to just Final Fantasy. There could be 2 games in a series and you could pick one of the other. That would be a perfect example. It could be Final Fantasy if you want. There's a million games in that series. You can use that, whatever. It's all good. So let me know all that in the comments section below. I think this is a really interesting topic that I'm very, very curious about hearing a lot of from other people's perspectives. So let me know all that anyway. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. You can follow me on Twitter. Details in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the rest of the videos in my channel.